Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Big Africa debate brought to you by Channel Africa in association with the Mail and Guardian. My name is Luyanda Maume. The Big Africa debate is an interactive platform for policy and decision makers, civil society experts, and the academia to discuss really and debate about challenges and opportunities for our great continent that we call home. Now, this year, the focus of the Big Africa debate is on economic development, specifically on infrastructure and the bankability of Africa anchored around politics and social issues. Today's discussion is private-public partnerships in Africa, how to create the foundation for the bankability of the transboundary projects. To this end, we have a great panel discussion coming up, but before we get there, let's remind you that this webinar is live on Channel Africa through www.channelafrica.co.za, on Channel 802 on the DSTV audio bouquet. My name is Luyanda. We are also on Channel 628 on OpenView, the SABC YouTube channel, as well as the Mail and Guardian website. We'll kick off today's proceedings by inviting the SABC Chief Operating Officer, Mr. Ian Plakis, to give us his opening remarks about today's event. Now, this year, the focus of the Big Africa debate is on economic development.
Thank you very much, and good morning all. On behalf of the South African Broadcasting Corporation, I am delighted to welcome you to today to the final Big Africa
Today's
debate
discussion
event
is private-public partnerships in Africa.
This,
how to create the foundation for the bankability of
for
the
the Big
transboundary
Africa
projects.
debate, which is an annual interactive platform for policy and decision makers, civil society, experts, and academia to discuss and debate the challenges and opportunities
let's remind you that this
for
webinar
Africa.
is live on Channel
The
Africa
SABC
through
and its broadcast platforms are poised to drive such an initiative with welcome support from our partners, the Mail and Guardian. The SABC is a vital public media organization that
Channel
reaches
802
over
on the
30
DSTV
million
audio bouquet.
people on radio
We are also on
and
Channel
more than
628 on
20 million
OpenView,
people
the
on
SABC
TV
YouTube channel,
every
as well as
week
the Mail and
in South
Guardian
Africa
website.
alone.
We'll kick off today's
With 5
proceedings by
television
inviting
channels
the
and
SABC
19
Chief
radio
Operating
platforms,
Officer, Mr.
we are
Ian
proud
Plakis, to
to
give us his opening
broadcast
remarks.
in all official languages in South Africa and more. As the largest public
About today's
broadcaster
event. Ian,
on the
over to you.
continent, the SABC
Thank
has
you
a
very
responsibility
much, and good morning
and the
all.
reach
On
to
behalf
change
of the
any
South African
debate on Africa
Broadcasting Corporation,
into a
I am delighted
big
to welcome
Africa
you today to the final
Our corporate
Big
vision
Africa debate
is to
event
become the leading
Africa
credible
Month.
voice and face of the nation
the inaugural
and the
year
continent.
for the Big
And we
Africa
pride
debate,
ourselves
which
in
is an
achieving
annual
our
interactive
vision
platform
and our
for policy and
responsibility
decision makers,
to inform,
civil society,
educate, and entertain not only South Africans, but our fellow African brothers and sisters who consume our contents, our products, and our services beyond our borders. SABC News covers stories independently and impartially from an African perspective and travels extensively to ensure we deliver sound journalism and trusted news to our viewers and listeners. Our SABC News channel can be seen in over 30 countries across our continent on digital bouquets. The SABC's video entertainment business produces award-winning and compelling African content that can be seen on a myriad of platforms in South Africa and into Africa and the diaspora. SABC licenses content internationally, and we can dub our top dramas, documentaries, and educational programs into any language to suit the needs of our local audiences anywhere in the world. The reach of SABC Radio is vast. We broadcast in 19 different languages. Our Channel Africa platform alone broadcasts in 5 different languages: French, Portuguese, Swahili, Chayanja, and Shilozi. Channel Africa is the key platform where we want to focus on building new continental partnerships and collaborative compelling content for our radio listeners across Africa. A strong public broadcaster makes for a strong nation and a more informed citizenry. Channel Africa is the key platform to drive the Africa Big Debate series, which takes place during each Africa Month. The debate topics are determined by the salient and pressing issues on the continent, guided by the annual theme of the African Union. The 2022 AU theme is Building Resilience in Nutrition on the African Continent. Accelerate the human capital, social and economic development, which leads us to today's exciting webinar. This inaugural debate series seeks to critically examine topical subjects from the continent's political, economic, social realm, focusing on Africa's bankability and infrastructure development. Our topic for today's discussion, the final debate in our series, is private, public, partnerships in Africa. How to create the foundation for bankability of transboundary projects. In line with the SABC values of respect, trust, integrity, and quality, we are pleased to bring to conclusion this annual journey of engagement and dialogue around key issues that can help us all collectively build the Africa we want. As a continent, we have many pressing issues and challenges, but we also have brilliant minds that can work collaboratively to resolve our own unique problems with uniquely African solutions. Let's get ready to hear from some of them now. I thank you for your contribution and participation in this event and in anticipation for executing on these discussions beyond this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, for those very great opening comments. And remember, we are live on Channel Africa on www.channelafrica.co.za, on Channel 802 on the DSTV audio bouquet. You can also find us on Channel 628 on OpenView. We are also on the SABC YouTube channel as well as the Mail and Guardian website. Without further ado, we'll move straight to our panel discussion. And just like the first one in Cape Town, it gives me great pleasure to tell you that this one is also moderated by a very, very talented young man that I respect so much, Aldrin Sampier. He is the host of African Perspectives on the SABC News Channel 404, and he's also a host on Beyond the Headline on SAFM daily between 3 and 6 p.m. Monday to Friday. Aldrin, it's over to you, and yeah, take it away. I know you're going to do a great job on this one.
All right, greetings everyone. As Luyanda has said, that I'm Aldrin Sampier, but as you can see, not so young as he makes me out to be. I'm a very old man. I'm 34 years old, so I reject this title of being a young man. But sure, we live on a continent that has a lot of potential, and as we've always been told, that potential also lies in looking at the number of young people that we have on this continent and also the potential that is there. And we look at today's conversation and the topic for today being private-public partnership in Africa, how to create the foundation for the bankability of transboundary projects. One of the other issues is also when we deal with a conversation like this, you look at the synergies between the private sector as well as the public sector. But what about people-to-people relations as well? Because we know that these public institutions and these private institutions are not just brick and mortar that we're speaking about, but these are institutions that are occupied by human beings. And these, we need to speak about the people-to-people relations and how do we harness that people-to-people relationship to make sure that those synergies between the public and private sector continue to benefit the African continent. Let me quickly introduce my guest joining us for this conversation. We have Dr. Towela Nyirenda-Jere, who is the head of economic integration at the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. Also joining us today is Mike Salo, who is the acting director, infrastructure and urban development at the African Development Bank, and Kutwane, CEO, Export Credit Insurance Corporation, South Africa, SOC Limited. I'm going to ask my guest just a 1-minute quick introduction. Just quickly tell us about the institution that you work for, and then we'll go into the conversation this morning. And to the people who are joining us for this conversation online, remember that on the top of your screen, there is an icon that has the Q&A bubble attached to it. That's the chat box that you can use. So any questions and comments that you have for our panelists, feel free to type in there. Just be clear as well who you're directing that question to or comment to, if it is indeed to any of the panelists, or in general just a comment that will be accepted as well. And then to people joining us via YouTube as well, please feel free to give your comments as well as your questions. The same rules apply there as well. Indicate who you're directing that question or comment to. Dr. Towela Nyirenda-Jere, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let's start off with you. Tell us more about the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and what exactly it is that it focuses on.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you, and good morning to the viewers and the listeners and those who are following online. So the African Union Development Agency, as the name indicates, is Africa's premier development institution, charged and mandated with facilitating and coordinating all development activities across the continent in line with the prescribed frameworks and priorities of the African Union. And I think it's important in that context to be very specific about the fact that we have the African Union's Agenda 2063, which is our template and our blueprint for development on the continent. And as the AUDA-NEPAD, we are charged with making sure that those priorities are implemented, but also tracking and monitoring progress and looking at how to resolve some of the challenges that we face in terms of implementing these priorities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nyirenda-Jere. We will continue our debate and delve more into the work that's being done by the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. Let's now move over to Mike Silo, Acting Director, Infrastructure and Urban Development at the African Development Bank. And Mike, I guess let's start off this conversation by congratulating you. Well done on the appointment. I know it's an acting position, but a lot can happen in those acting positions. Welcome.
Thank you very much, my dear brother, and also good morning, my dear sister Towela, and co-panelist Kutwane. It's always a pleasure to have shared a panel here, and also a pleasure to be on SABC, I guess, for me for the first time. And thanks for your congratulatory work. My name is Mike Salau, Acting Director for Infrastructure and Urban Development at the African Development Bank. And I'm also in charge of overseeing, coordinating the bank's PPP activities. We just approved a framework, which I'll have opportunity to dive into during the discussion. So also project preparation of the bank. I'm also overseeing the NEPAD IPPF project preparation facility, which I'm sure will also contribute to PPP discussion here today. So happy to be here. Exchange.
Thank you so much, Mike. And let's move over now to Kutwane. Kutwane, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us as well this morning for this conversation. Kutwane, I have to say though, that so I've met a Kladi and I've met a Mokweng, and now for the first time speaking to a Kutwane. I don't know if you want to tell us about the name and the surname quickly, Kutwane, before we go into the exceptional work that you guys do at the ECIC.
Thanks, Edwin, and thanks to both the listeners, those who are listening, and those who are watching this program on various channels that you have mentioned. Yes, we of the royalty do not like to, talk too much about what our names mean, because we have to fetch history from times immemorial. So just to say that, yes, it means I'm royalty. And I'm a Sotho-speaking South African, so that should be all. And first and foremost, let me just basically say that we are very happy as ECIC to be invited to this debate, and definitely supporting the initiatives that SABC, in collaboration with Mail and Guardian, have actually you know, 59 years ago when AU was established. Export Credit Insurance Corporation of South Africa was established in 2001, basically seeing the need to support the South African government policy, trade policy, ensuring that we can facilitate export of South African capital goods and services at the time by underwriting the bank loans that were going towards financing of those projects in which South African contractors are involved in on the continent. And I must say that, I mean, we have seen a lot since then of developments that have taken place. And now we are in our we have now celebrated our 20 years of establishment. And I joined ECIC in 2013. I'm now about to exit as the CEO, as my contract is due to end next month. So I will be on the job hunt. African Development Bank, please decide. Thank you.
I think, moderator, I think
you had a problem there with the mic. It's one of those things, got to remember to unmute yourself. Getting used to this thing. So just a reminder again to the people who are joining us online that go to the Q&A icon on the top if you have any comments and questions to our panelists, and to those people who are joining us on YouTube as well, feel free to go into the comment and question section there as well, and just direct your questions and comments to any of our panelists. A reminder again of this morning's conversation and the topic: private-public partnership in Africa, how to create the foundation for the bankability of transboundary projects. And Dr. Nyirenda-Jere, I'm going to start off with you. What does this topic mean for NEPAD, considering that one of the issues that NEPAD also deals with is with that problem statement that says that this is the problems, or these are the problems that we face as a continent, but these are some of the solutions that we have looked at?
Thank you very much for that question. And also maybe just to reiterate, I think that this is a very timely topic. in terms of obviously where we are as ending Africa Month, but also in terms of where we are in terms of the state of Africa's development. So for AUDA-NEPAD, I think we are very cognizant of the fact that infrastructure plays a very key and pivotal role in terms of underpinning a lot of the socio-economic development aspirations of the continent. So whether we're talking about health, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about trade, all of these really depend on the connectedness and connectivity of our various countries, being able to facilitate the movement of people, goods and services, but also being able to link people to opportunities and to services as well. Now, when we look very specifically at infrastructure on the continent, we understand that the needs are huge. We also know that the financing gap is huge. And we acknowledge the fact that a lot of our infrastructure perhaps is funded through public resources, and that the contributions perhaps from the private sector are still at a level where they could perhaps increase and ably support the development aspirations of the continent. What we also, I think, are very aware of is the fact that, when we look at the landscape, the plans are there. We have the program for infrastructure development in Africa, which is our blueprint in terms of how we're going to use infrastructure to transform the continent. We have various policies and mechanisms in place. And what we really need to think about is how do we make the necessary linkages between where money is and where the needs are. As you've rightly pointed out, we know what the challenges are. But we now need to start making the links between those challenges and the solutions. For infrastructure specifically, we are very aware of the fact that transboundary projects are very complicated, that they require quite a bit of time and effort in terms of preparing them and getting them to the level where they can actually be investable. And I think that is one of the things that AUDA-NEPAD has focused on, and I'm sure that Mike will also perhaps, as he talks about how the African Development Bank supports infrastructure on the continent, allude to the very important role that project preparation plays and really helps in terms of making sure that these projects that we have identified as priorities are actually able to be matched with the requisite funding that is available out there.
And Mike, based on what Dr. Nyirenda-Jere had just said now, we'll speak about the work that you're currently doing in the next few minutes. But at that initial phase, and now this is now speaking about the work that you were doing while at NEPAD, at the IPPF, is what are some of the hurdles that were identified in terms of starting up projects and some of the reasons that corporate, for instance, have said that they don't want to go that route?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are many hurdles to regional project or continental or cross-border project. The first one is actually for the countries to accept, to come together and agree to do such a project. It seems very trivial, but it's one of the bottlenecks that we see, that two countries agrees to jointly come together, put infrastructure across, and facilitate the movement of goods and people using that infrastructure. That has been a bottleneck. But thanks to the recent improvement and also evolution, we've seen a lot of countries signing MOUs to do regional projects. We have also seen countries doing joint identification to really have a joint priority to do a project, and also agree to jointly pursue those projects at the same time. Very often you see that this one country A is willing to go now, country B is still going through a lot of thinking and so forth. So that particular first phase is very important. That's why I think institutions like AUDA-NEPAD, African Union, and the RECs are actually well suited to enable that environment to make sure that country has joint and align on priorities and agree to develop joint project together. This is key. The second one is once you do that, then the question becomes, how do I transform this project into a bankable project that would attract both public and private sector financing? That's where the whole, technicalities actually kicks in, because you need to demonstrate on a technical basis that this project is doable, feasible, and you also need to demonstrate on a financial aspect that this project can actually, carry on a return for the investor, and also the economical aspect that is bringing value to the whole society, and on the environmental aspect that is not harming the environment. And these are the considerations that we normally will look at to do such a thing. And again, cross-border project or regional project demand a lot of coordination. Coordination meaning that you need to have, agencies in country A working with agencies in country B, coordinating with the regional agency, which very often are in the RECs, SADC, ECOWAS, and so forth, and which in turn should have institutional capacity that's required. So that's another hurdle, institutional capacity to coordinate across the different, stakeholders in a regional project. So, being fully aware of this, and that's what the African Development Bank has positioned itself to be, not only providing the financial support to prepare and finance downstream the project, but also to provide technical assistance, which will help the countries to really have the required capacity to align on their priority, capacity to coordinate, capacity to also, technically vet the studies and the outcome of those, studies that will make them to make investment decisions. That's very important. We tend to forget that, but the decision is actually led by the countries and the economic community. And for that, they need to have the requisite capacity to do so. And we are here as African Development Bank working with AUDA-NEPAD and AU and the RECs to capacitate the countries to do that. That has been one of our focus areas. The NEPAD IPPF that you mentioned was able to do that, is able to do that, not only prepare the environment, but also prepare the project and provide technical assistance where the bank will come in and do the actual investment that's required. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And then, Kutuano, there is the issue around the risks that corporate then sees going into the continent. And as I said earlier on that show, when we speak about institutions, whether it's private or public, we're speaking about human beings that occupy those institutions. And sometimes there is an issue around the reliability, number one, of those human beings that are there, but how those human beings are also able to influence policy and policy direction. And then comes in the question around political risk moving into the continent.
Thanks, Adrian. Indeed, I mean, it is let me just start by saying that it's now a well accepted, a solution that, we need to approach this large infrastructure projects through public-private partnerships. Obviously, when you do that, you expect that, each part in that partnership, each participant in that partnership is going to play their part to ensure that, the project come to fruition. From our side, on the risk side, definitely we accept that, with this project being as complex as my colleagues already have pointed out, and also requiring a lot of patience and effort in working them out. At the same time, immediately you start talking cross-border, you are talking about more enlarged, risk, be it of the political nature. Mostly the risk that we see on the continent would be of instability or perceived in the private sector of participating in these large, long lead times and long tenure projects. So sometimes this kind of risk, they come through, currency problems where now you cannot transfer your profits out of the host country, of the country, one country, that the revenues are collected, and then you are unable to recoup your investments, and therefore that's where you need some sort of a risk mitigation that will allow you to be able to not lose, so to say. Some risks are basically due to governments changing. We have seen a number of coups, especially in West Africa, which can upset the interest of the private sector players in those projects. Sometimes it's disruptions that are terrorist attacks and or action by insurgents, as we have seen in Mozambique. We were participating in the LNG gas project there, sponsored by Total, where all of a sudden in the Cabo Delgado area, the insurgents started, and all of a sudden the work that had already begun on the offshore site were had to be suspended. And these are kind of things that actually slow progress, in attracting private participation. From our side, then we say, as all ECAs or export credit agencies do, from the South African side, we want to see South African contractors participating in this project, and therefore, in order to enable them to find it attractive to participate in this project, we put in the risk mitigation solutions, which is a risk cover or risk insurance to cover them against any of those incidents that have been have been outlined in the policy of insurance, in case those events come to fruition. And with the coming in of COVID, we have seen also a lot of projects being in distress, and cross-border projects especially being affected as all these were suspended. And if you have an ACA behind you, like ECIC, then we are able to get in and work with our partners, be they the providers of long-term financing, most especially banks. Then we get involved in the restructuring of those projects so that they can sort of smooth out, or they can ride out the wave, and get them to the safe side when such events happen. And we have actually done a lot of those restructurings, which have made now the projects, once this scourge of the pandemic are over, we have seen the project now start to move in the right direction, sometimes through the extension of the term of the loans, and sometimes through basically restructuring the cash profile or the cash flow profile of those projects. I will also be coming up later on in terms of the work we are doing, both with the NEPAD and as well as with the African Development Bank, the Afrexim Bank, on the capturing of the financing side to make it more more generalized, in terms of how we work together in collaboration to be, not at the back end as usually the insurance companies will come once the project has taken off, but why we have to get in at the front end of the project, so that we understand all those dynamics of complexity or the complexities of the project preparation, etc., etc. Thank you.
And thanks on that, Dr. Nyirenda-Jere. On the particular part about, if you look at insurgencies on the continent, is one thing that we know is that it needs human beings. It's human beings who carry out this. How then do you approach a conversation that says that when we have projects, mega projects of this nature, like for instance with the Total as well in Cabo Delgado, that you have a project where the communities themselves also feel a sense of ownership of the project and therefore part of the project, and also the ability to say that this is it, because the other issue that NEPAD is facing is looking at and ensuring that we have adequate capacity when it comes to human resources.
So I think a very good point that you're making there in terms of how we get communities involved. And I think we must always remind ourselves why it is that we're doing what we're doing. We're doing it for the citizenry. We're doing it for our people. And at the core and at the heart of everything that we do, we always have to be mindful of that. Now, from AUDA-NEPAD's perspective, I think maybe I'll touch on one or two things. The first one, I think, is just the fact that we are very careful about developing what we call fit-for-purpose tools that enable us to have these structured engagements with stakeholders at various levels. So, for instance, Mike was talking about the fact that there's a need for a lot of coordination with various stakeholders, and we do that through a tool which we call the service delivery mechanism that allows us to really sit together with the project sponsors, understand what the project is all about, agree on what the various interventions that are needed to get that project moved from the inception phase all the way through pre-feasibility to feasibility and then onwards to bankability. So we make sure that they are a part of the process and that we have that regular contact and communication with them to understand the needs and to structure the appropriate interventions. At the same time, when you start now looking at the issue perhaps of the various communities who are the beneficiaries of these projects, but who also stand to benefit in terms of being service providers to the projects, we have developed what we call the Job Creation Toolkit, which allows us to really look at these projects from the lens of how do they create economic opportunities for the communities surrounding as well as for the for other national stakeholders. So the toolkit allows us to, on the one hand, anticipate the skills that are needed to bring these projects to construction, but it also helps us to understand how the project can actually be used to benefit local communities as service providers and suppliers to the project. So if we know that a project is, for instance, going to come online and start being constructed 3 to 5 years from now, we can already start anticipating the skills that are needed, but we can also start anticipating in terms of the supply of materials. So where will we get cement from? Where will we get the gravel from? How do we make sure that we can structure the project such that local MSMEs and SMEs can benefit from that project? But this also then requires that our member states have the requisite policies in terms of local content to support that, and also the policies in terms of MSME development to enable those communities to benefit from those projects. The last thing that I want to mention is, and Mike spoke about the fact that even as you're starting to develop these projects, just from prioritizing and identifying projects, that there's a lot of consultation and coordination that needs to happen. One of the things that we did in terms of PIDA and the current priority action plan that we are implementing was that we took an approach which we have called the corridor approach. So it's an integrated corridor approach, which is looking at the infrastructure, but also looking at the wider benefits in terms of the communities through which that infrastructure passes. So how do we make sure that that infrastructure is serving the needs of health, serving the needs of education, serving the needs of access to markets? And so as we build that infrastructure, we have to always be mindful of those communities where that infrastructure is passing and how we will make sure that the benefits actually accrue to the communities around that infrastructure.
And Mike, then there's of course the question around when it comes to the informal sector as well. And I was looking at a report from the UNCTAD that says that where do we locate the informal trade market? A question which, according to the UNCTAD, could account for at least 90% of trade flows for some countries. Which is a huge figure if we look at it. But how do you ensure that there's also a cooperation between these informal sectors? Because there's always this issue around finding that people that are in the informal sector are more saturated, are more in various areas, and not really have a solidified singular approach to how we deal with the trade amongst different countries when it comes to informal trading.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think just before I respond, I would like to just come back to a couple of issues that my co-panelists have raised. The issue of risk. I think risk is, a fundamental part of the PPP structure. The whole idea of going for PPP is because you want to identify which party is best placed to manage the risk when it comes to the project financing and also its management. That's where the private sector and the public sector have to come together and apportion that risk. And for that, there was mention of political risk and currency risk. And that's what the African Development Bank is there to do. We have put in place a credible instrument, guarantee product, to also address the political risk side of things. It's a partial risk guarantee. And also the financial, part of the risk, which is a, partial credit risk. Those two instruments are there to support any PPP project to unlock private sector participation and reassure private sector, because two things that they are concerned about is the return and the safety of their return. So we are there. So we have those instruments. The other one, quickly, is what we call credit enhancement. Those are the instruments that are very important to de-risk further this project and make it very attractive, like viability gap funding, to make a PPP, which is otherwise not viable on its own, become viable, because the government will have also step in to put some viability gap funding. That's how we are able to finance a lot of PPP projects. And as a rule of thumb on the continent today, what we see from the African Development Bank is that 70% of all infrastructure are financed by public sector. Around 15 to 20 in PPP and 5 to 10 in a purely private sector. So that means there's a room for improvement for PPP, but that can only happen if you address this issue of risk. I just thought that I should actually mention it. And that's what the African Development Bank PPP strategic framework, which was just been approved this year, 3 pillars, actually aim to address and capacitate our countries. The other issue about stakeholders, I think is very important, as you mentioned. You must not forget, infrastructure is about service delivery. We deliver service to the economy, we deliver service to the people. And you cannot have any sustainable solution without involving the people. And that's how this whole issue of stakeholder consultation is paramount to the success of the PPP. And from our approach from the African Development Bank is you cannot do any project without involving the stakeholder from the get-go, from the conception to the financing and to the implementation. So we have stakeholder involvement across the spectrum just to ensure that they are actually full and part of this. And also because they are the one to fund this infrastructure. PPP, 2 ways you can fund it: user pay fees or government availability payment. So again, it comes back to the stakeholder, the users, to fund their own infrastructure. That's what they need to be involved. Otherwise, the service will not be responding to their demand. And lastly, to talk about the question of human capital, I think it's critical. We tend to forget this aspect that, as you mentioned, rightly so, this is about people. So to do the planning, you need people with a lot of capacity. To do the financing structure, we need people with a lot of capacity. To manage the contract, which is the key, the most complex part of PPP is contract management, because it's a long-term contract. You are in there for long haul. 30 years, you need people with a strong technical capacity to manage the project. So the human capital aspect of things is very important. And I think that's where education system and also, the whole industrial capacity should be put to use to support the implementation of PPP. And we have programs also in the bank to do that, in addition to what others are doing. And to finally land on your question, which is the informal sector in trading. And I think, again, if you look at the African economic structure, you mentioned that figure, about 80 to 90% are involved in informal trade, which increasingly are being more structured today because they are able to be taxed by the government. That means they have, we're getting some form of structuring going on. But this is a pattern that we see across the board. And this will continue to be the case unless we start, addressing the issue that causes the root causes of informality. One of them is a lack of access to finance. A lot of SMEs would like to go fully structured or formal, but they lack access to finance. They go to the banks has all kinds of conditions, and that actually that's what we call market failure. That you have one hand a lot of demand, and the other hand supply is not responding to demand. So we need to address the issue of access to capital for SMEs to move from purely informality to somehow formality. The second is also, the issue of business services. We do have consulting firms at the top level, but what we also need is the one that are at the lower level to advise, help to structure, create business plan, and gradually move those informal trading to actually, go into a structural way. But informal trading is a huge part of our economy, and we must not discount that. Some of people that, most people have actually have 1 or 2 people in their family that have involved in actually informal trading, and actually informal trading have put people to school, have invested in real estate, and so there's a lot of wealth in that informal trading, but it just needs to be, helped and facilitated so that those who can grow enough to move into the structural way should be allowed to do so. But that requires that the government and the private sector, and also us as an institution, have a strong SME approach, which the African Development Bank is championing today. We are actually scaling up our SME approach. We provide a lot of lines of credit to the banks, particularly in Southern Africa region, where those banks should on-lend to small, medium-sized businesses, which are informal business and formal business, so that they can actually start, gradually moving away from that informality. But my personal view is that formality should not be dismissed. It's a part of our economy. What we need to do is gradually help them to move away, because they actually help to address poverty. Poverty in our society, and they should be supported. They should be helped so that they can actually grow their business and move into informal trade. And if you look at cross-border, the whole facilitation of trade is, most of the people you see crossing borders are actually, also formal and informal. And we cannot have a solution that excludes the informality. We must bring them in, but very inclusive way, to also, help them to become very formal. It's a topic that I actually personally like to discuss more. But I'll hand over back to you. Thanks.
I think it's a topic that we should all feel passionate about, because Dr. Nyirenda-Jere, one thing is that what is considered to be the informal traders of today become the multinationals of tomorrow, but of course they need the support to get to that particular point, and also the lessons that are then learned. And from the African Union Development Agency side, what are some of the lessons that have been learned that we could then share with the regional economic communities, to say that when it comes to your development financial institutions, this is what you need to be taking into consideration as well, considering how the continent is growing, and now, for instance, with the African Free Trade Area as well?
So I think we have a wealth of collective experience, I think, across our various institutions. I mean, when you look at, the African Development Bank, the African Union Commission, the UNECA, ourselves, the regional economic communities, and even institutions such as the Export Credit Insurance Corporation and others similar to it. I think the collective wealth of experience is huge, and I think it is something that we should always, I think, remember, that we're not starting from zero. We've been there, we've done things, and we need to sort of figure out how we build on what we've done and where we've been. I think at AUDA-NEPAD, one of the things that we have consistently seen and learned, especially in terms of infrastructure development, is the fact that, number one, obviously, we want to make sure that we have that credible pipeline of projects that can actually attract investment. And to do that requires that whole idea of how do we all pull together, how do we leverage the collective mandates, collective responsibilities to actually achieve that. But how do we also hold each other accountable in terms of making sure that we're actually tracking progress? When I started at the very beginning, I alluded to the fact that we understand the challenges in terms of the infrastructure gap, but we also know that the money is there. And we sort of have a mismatch in terms of how do we connect the gap to where the money is. Africa currently collects close to about $500 billion in tax revenue. Our pension and sovereign wealth funds have in excess of $3 trillion as far as their assets under management, which could easily meet the infrastructure deficit and infrastructure gap across the continent. For PEDA, currently, we estimate that the priority plan to 2030 will require about $161 billion, of which perhaps $11 billion would be needed for project preparation. The challenge we have there is that, number one, we're not putting enough resources into project preparation, because we will not be able to access the funds insofar as having these projects funded if the projects are not well prepared. So we need to find sustainable means of actually funding project preparation so that those projects can get to investability. The second challenge, I think, is when we look at the pension and sovereign wealth fund, and especially the pension fund sector, is that they're sometimes constrained by the legal and regulatory requirements that do not allow them to invest perhaps in cross-border infrastructure or in large infrastructure assets, partly because of the general perception, and I'm using the word perception deliberately, of risk. So how do we change that? How do we allow our pension funds to actually invest in cross-border infrastructure? It has been done. There are examples. Kenya is one good example where they have actually managed to do that, where they have actually allowed and enabled the pension funds to pool their resources together and allowed them to actually be able to invest in infrastructure as an asset class. So we need to think, how do we scale that up? How do we replicate? And how do we make sure that that is also able to happen across the continent? The other things I think we need to think about is the education systems and how we link education, skills development to job creation in infrastructure as well. But maybe I hand it back to you and to get perspectives from the other panelists as well.
Kutwana, would you like to add on that?
Yes, if I could actually add on what Towela said. I think there is also a problem of information dissemination. There is poor project, there's poor understanding or awareness amongst especially the private sector players, in terms of where these facilities are based and how they can be accessed. We know that there are a number of facilities. I know that in South Africa, DBSA has got a project preparation facility. ADB has got project preparation facilities, and many others, EIB and others. But for our private sector, most of the questions that we get asked when we are working through this, they say, where can I access this project preparation? I have a good idea, and I remember one person was talking about a haulage business in terms of tracking across borders, and was saying that, look, I need to understand the market on the other side. Perhaps, also how do I move my goods across from South Africa through Zimbabwe or to Botswana into Zambia and all those kind of things, because now you have to cross many borders. Now the problem is that if you do not have a clear, viable understanding of the dynamics throughout how that project will be like in terms of the logistical challenges, then you are going to be in trouble. And unfortunately, some of our would-be participants in our programs lack the understanding of how these facilities work, and I would like to hear more from my other fellow panelists in terms of how we can make it easier for people in terms of advocacy and in terms of communication to allow the people to understand, or the private sector to understand, how they can participate in these large projects. The second issue that I wanted to talk about, if you allow me, is that I think you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think this is the best initiative that towards integration on the continent since the establishment of the African Union 59 years ago. It's how we have I don't believe that we have really spent time and airtime really in popularizing the benefits of the African Continental Free Trade. In other areas that I visited, it is basically a household name. People are talking about it all the time. But in South Africa, I don't think we have reached the stage where it is on our lips whenever we address issues around integration and trade. So I think that is one of the challenges that we should try to overcome. Secondly, I think the other big issue here for us is whether there is we know there is a political will, but one has a feeling that we still are battling with the remnants of the past in terms of block approach or regionalized, more narrow regionalized approach, or even nationalistic approach, where when you are, and we have seen this sometimes, where there is always this tug of war when you are supposed to do a project. We were doing one project in Mozambique, the Nacala Rail and the logistics corridor passing through Malawi. And, to bring those together, it was a very difficult, tug of war type, arrangement. And how could we, and I heard, what, Mike was saying about coordination. That coordination is extremely important. In some instances, you need to establish a joint decision-making body so that, the authority of the government can be, mandated to this body so that it can be the ultimate arbiter in these cross-border projects. And, its decision can be final, and it will be made up of technical people or technical individuals from both or many countries that are participating. Indeed, these are complex projects, and, they need much more to undertake, they much more than just the political statements or political will. They need more on the ground, hardcore benefit differentiation as well as cost differentiation and allocation to various participants so that it is an equitable distribution of the benefits as well as the cost. Thanks.
Okay. I'll take the question now to our fellow panelists about the project preparation facility that is being made available or what is available. But just quickly, Kutwane, is on the question around the effectiveness of these economic blocks. When a client comes to the ECIC and says that, hey, we have a project that we'd like to that we are looking into, let's say for instance in ECOWAS, does the company then also look into the effectiveness of ECOWAS in terms of its economic ability to sustain a project of that nature?
Indeed, as part of the evaluation of the project, those are very important considerations. We are very much encouraged by the strides that have been taken by our RECs or regional economic commissions in terms of allowing, more, if you want, harmonized, arrangements, a harmonized framework for these projects to take place. And we have actually worked through a number of those, as you have rightfully mentioned. Mozambique is one case in point, and then recently we have just done a project, the Beit Bridge border crossing project, which also included an upgrade of the ICT environment or the whole of the, more digitalizing that massive paperwork that had to be done there, making it much easier for people and goods to cross over those borders. So I think, you are absolutely right. We have to work through these, regional blocks because they create an environment where there is a common understanding and a common framework through which project can done. And if you look in East Africa, for example, most of the, rail and road projects that are being done, and you look at West Africa, the Trans-Sahara Highway, these are the projects that, you undertake them, and there is an agreement amongst the economic blocks that in actual fact this is going to be a beneficial project, and it is going to benefit the people or even the countries through which the highway passes as an adjunct. And you have now if you are talking about the Trans-Sahara Railway, you have countries like Chad benefiting from that and maybe down towards Nigeria. So absolutely correct.
Yeah. Yeah, moderator, if you can hear me. Okay, now you're back. Okay, can I just react to that quickly? A few issues here that have been mentioned. I think starting from the last one, the issue of importance of coordination among countries, and also the role of the RECs. And I think we often have to recall that the RECs are the building block of the integration of the continent, and that's their role. And they have been set up to do just that. SADC, for instance, have to make sure that there is a consensus among its member countries on priority projects that they need to deliver. There's also, the necessary coordination mechanism has to be set in place in the particular REC to make sure that, there's
Okay, Mike, I'm going to ask you to quickly try and switch off your TV because we hear some delayed sound coming from the background. I don't know if you have any device that is working at the moment where it is projecting the sound. It's giving us a slight echo there. Or if there's anyone of our panelists who has their mics on, if you can please try to switch off your mics. Okay, Mike, you can go ahead.
Okay, so the role of the RECs is particularly important for us to really achieve that benefit of having cross-regional projects, because at the end of the day, we have a very small market. We need to open up the markets, and that goes through a regional project, and which I think is really the essence of the African Union, the PIDA program, which Towela just mentioned, and also, the aim of African Development Bank supporting regional integration by heavily financing regional projects. And so we do so also by capacitating the RECs to really have the adequate capacity and coordination skills and institutional setup that is required to do this coordination that's required. And one thing that we also, realize is that the RECs that are able to do that actually see increase in the intra-regional trade. That's the case of East African community, where we see the intra-regional trade in East Africa in the region of about 50%, compared to lower than what we see in West Africa. Although we have major corridors going through West African countries, but the issue of facilitation becomes very important. One-stop border posts, which I think the East Africa and Southern Africa have experienced much more than other regions, has helped to increase intra-regional trade, for those regions. So our role, working with of course, African Union, AUDA-NEPAD, and the RECs, is to make sure that we deliver more one-stop border posts, so that when you have a hard infrastructure, you have those facilities to really facilitate, a harmonized policy, regulation, and rules on the transportation corridor, so that you can facilitate the movement of goods, and therefore also, enhancing internal trade. That's on the RECs, and also the issue of African Continental Free Trade Area, I think, is a major opportunity for all African countries to really take advantage of this free trade area to really, create the wealth and also increase their economic output. But before we do that, there are a few things that need to be put in place. There are issues of transport and trade facilitation. That's very important, because if you want to set up a factory in Zambia and you want to import cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire, you still need a land logistic to come in and bring your cocoa to Zambia, produce that chocolate in Zambia, and ship it to South Africa. So the issue of interconnectivity and multimodality of infrastructure becomes very important. We talk about roads very often, but we should not forget the air freight, airlines industry, and also the railway, which, on the longer term are very economical, less, expensive, and also green type of infrastructure, as well as, the navigable waters. So we need to look at infrastructure in a very holistic manner as to, lower the cost of logistic and then enhance competitiveness of our economy. Because let's not forget, in Africa, one of the huge source of, cost of doing business is actually transportation. Transportation cost is very high in Africa, and we cannot accept that. That has to change, and that goes through the major regional project that open up Africa on its own, and then also facilitate cross-border project. And I think that's what the whole PIDA, program is all about. We've done PIDA 1. Now we are going for PIDA 2, second phase of PIDA, which I think collectively we have to really, massively support, so that we can deliver the regional integration, the Agenda 2063 that we're all thinking about. And lastly, but not least, I think, my brother Kutwane. I think we're going to be very, very good friend after this panel discussion. Towela, and we work together already because we really need the insurance companies, the export credit agencies in financing infrastructure, particularly on the PPP side. They constitute a big opportunity for financing infrastructure in Africa, and we are not able to leverage that enough. So some of the few projects we are doing now is to how do we bring in, insurance companies to de-risk our projects and also use ECA to finance. And one example that I really, like to talk about, which I even did last week during the African Development Bank annual meetings in Accra. I'm still in Accra, by the way, is Tanzania. The standard gauge rail between Tanzania and now Burundi and DRC, and also part of Rwanda and then DRC, is actually, a marvelous example of how a country like Tanzania is proactively leveraging funding from the commercial banks, insurance companies, ECAs, MDBs, and national government putting money to do this. And that's kind of a financial innovation, engineering that we need to do, but it has cost. And Kutwane will agree with me that you need to be able to negotiate the premium, and that's also something the African Development Bank is there to do, to help to lower the cost and have a longer tenure, so that to have a weighted average cost of capital and investment, which is something that's competitive, to help facilitate this kind of investment. We will need to work more and more with insurance companies and ECAs, and I think Kutwane and I has to talk extensively after this panel discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, we like hearing collaborations and cooperations that will be taking place based on conversations that we have here as part of the Big Africa debate. That's a great one. And please, Mike, as well as Kutwane, if there is any agreement that is signed, we'd like to come and witness it as the SABC, as Channel Africa, as well as the Mail and Guardian. Dr. Nyirenda-Jere, there's also another question about, so you have the infrastructure that is being built and infrastructure that is being planned, and Kutwane's company, the ECIC, for instance, would focus on the risk to the company itself. However, though, what about insulating projects from political interference, if that is possible at all, and how do you approach that? And I know it's a bit of a difficult one, but I'd like to push you a bit on this one. And if you look at the African Renaissance Dam project, for instance, which has become so contentious that you've had even the USA intervening, and where the argument is that the African Union is falling short in intervention and also finding a lasting solution that would benefit not only the people, that will not only benefit the people in Egypt, but also benefit the people in Ethiopia.
So thank you for that. So maybe before I talk about political interference, maybe let me just start by talking about political will. And I think Kutwane talked about how important political will is in terms of how we get our projects implemented. So when you look at our projects, for instance, in PIDA, I think political will is very strong. The commitments are very strong in terms of even just the very fact that this is something that has been adopted at the level of the African Union to drive Africa's aspirations for infrastructure development. And I think we should honor and acknowledge that. At the same time, we have the Presidential Infrastructure Champions Initiative, PICI, which was spearheaded by the government of South Africa and which is actually still led by the SA presidency. And the whole point of that is that it helps in terms of providing a platform and a means for our heads of states to champion specific infrastructure projects and help to elevate those projects in terms of unblocking some of the challenges the projects are facing and helping to mobilize the requisite support and resources for those projects. Now, the question of political interference, I think it's something that we have to live with, and not only on the African continent. I think this is not an African problem. But at the same time, I think it always perhaps has to go back to what are the collective aspirations. in terms of the different countries, in terms of the continent. When Kutwane was talking about the fact that sometimes when we're doing our projects, we have to be able to cede the responsibility to supranational agencies that would act on behalf of governments. We've seen this working very well, for instance, in ECOWAS with the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, where we've been able to have that sort of body established that looks at the interests of the 5 participating member states and is able, therefore, to resolve some of the issues perhaps that could arise in terms of the implementation of the project. So maybe we need to start revisiting our models and our approaches in terms of how we actually structure the various agreements between governments as to how these projects would be implemented, because that would help us then to already proactively avoid some of the situations perhaps that we see with some of the projects on the continent.
Thank you so much for that. Actually, the other point that was raised during the conversation that we had with Dolika Banda, who's the chairperson of ZCCM, was that when it comes to those super agencies that you speak of, and whether it is a sovereign wealth fund agency or a company that invests on behalf of the state, is how do you make sure that those companies operate in a manner that is seen to be as that of a corporate citizen instead of behaving like it is a government institution itself. But just a quick one, Dr. Nyirenda-Jere, the point that was raised earlier on by Kutwane around these preparation project facilities that are available, and also making sure that people actually know about them. Where do they find this information?
That's also a very fair and valid point. So we also, I think, together with other agencies such as the African Development Bank and even the DBSA that was mentioned, we recognize that this was also quite a challenge, that there's a myriad number of facilities, agencies, institutions that are working in terms of supporting projects. And we created 2 different platforms that were meant to help us in terms of bringing people together and helping to sort of share information, but also understand then how do we collectively unblock some of these challenges. The first one was the Continental Business Network, which is a platform that would serve to really bring private sector and governments together so that they could already start discussing some of these projects, start anticipating some of the challenges that perhaps would be faced in terms of structuring these projects and bringing them to market. The second one was a private project preparation facilities network. And the idea behind that was to have all the PPFs sit at a table, exchange information, understand how the criteria that they all use in terms of how they assess projects, and really start to look at, could we have some kind of a harmonized approach and a harmonized way of dealing with project preparation so that the entities and the project sponsors that want to access these funds perhaps don't struggle in terms of navigating these different facilities. So that PPF network exists. Perhaps it needs to be energized in terms of just really bring that collective energy of the PPFs together. But there's definitely a lot of information sharing that does happen between the different financial institutions and then between the different stakeholders as well.
Thank you so much for that. Let's quickly bring in another panelist to have a conversation with us about the continent's energy needs. And if you look at the African Development Bank's own assessment, it says that where we stand currently, we have about only 40% of the continent's population that has access to electricity. But what about making sure that we get as many people as possible to have access to that electricity? We are now joined by Farai. Farai, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. Tell us about the projects that are available and the projects that we see that on the continent we could access, and make sure that those projects are actually bankable.
Good morning, and good morning to the viewers. Indeed, there are quite a number of projects on the continent right now that are under development, all with the aim of increasing access. Like you rightfully said, access to electricity right now is quite low across the continent. It's an impediment to economic growth. It's also negatively affects the quality of life for our citizens. In that regard, the bank is working on quite a number of projects across the continent. We have in North Africa, we have the Desert to Power program that looks and is aimed at facilitating the introduction of renewable energy projects and renewable energy across the countries in the Sahel region. We also are very actively looking and assisting the various regional economic communities and indeed countries in terms of ensuring that we get more projects that reach bankability. If you look at our new deal on energy for Africa, one of the key priorities there is to ensure access to all by 2025, and that's the vision that we're working against. We are currently, obviously, in the process of updating this strategy at the moment. And from our analysis, one of the key issues and priority areas that we need to focus on is to ensure that we can link up the various countries through regional interconnectors or through country-to-country interconnectors. If one looks, for example, in Southern Africa, we have most of the countries already connected to the Southern African Power Group, except for only 3. And there are projects that are currently being developed to ensure that there is access and there is interconnectivity between the countries to bring power from areas that might have surpluses. For example, if one looks at Angola right now, it has excess power, and yet some members within the SADC region have deficits. One can, for example, look at some of the challenges that we currently have in South Africa. So regional interconnectors are very key, and we are working to ensure, for example, just as a start, that in Southern Africa, specifically in this case, that we get the whole of the Southern African Power Pool interconnected. There are also similar programs that are ongoing across the continent, and part of the support that we are providing is to the regional power pools to capacitate them, to develop some of the critical policies, especially around wheeling charges that will then enable the power to flow, like I said, from areas of surplus to areas of deficit. I think obviously we have some big projects, for example, Inga, that the bank has been supporting now for a number of years, and we really are looking at ensuring that such big projects, which at the end of the day, the tariff out of those projects is reasonable and low in many cases, come to fruition. But in terms of our focus, really, it's bringing more renewable energy projects on the continent. And from renewable energy, there's also the benefit of having off-grid systems that can support smaller communities in the process. So it's quite a challenge, but the bank is very committed to ensuring that we increase access across the continent for.
And just finally, Farai, as a regional manager on energy, I'll take this question to the panelists as well, is looking here at South Africa with our infrastructure needs when it comes to electricity and also the lack of reliability on our electricity supply, and the announcement that came from our government that said that now we're also increasing the ability of private entities to generate private electricity and increase that to about 100 megawatts. Is that the route to go? Is this something that countries on the continent should be exploring, to say that are there private entities that are available that have the deep pockets, because we know how expensive it is to invest in energy infrastructure, to say that this is how much energy capacity we can create, and therefore we will be able to plug into the transmission grids of our national energy supply to make sure that there is availability of energy?
Yes, it is indeed a solution to some of the problems. But recalling that the lack of generation capacity, and I think this is largely what this discussion has been, is because the public sector cannot continue to finance some of the projects, especially given the needs within the countries, especially to support some of the social the social requirements. So indeed, having such an approach as taken in South Africa could be beneficial to the system. If you look at the expected outcome of that announcement, I think it was indicated that close to between 4,000 and 5,000 megawatts could actually be unlocked by that policy. However, as countries do that, it's also critical to ensure from the utilities perspective that is able to then accommodate within the system the intermittent nature of the generation that is likely to come in. Because most of the time it's still really solar PV that will end up being installed at the lower or at the small megawatt capacities that we are talking about. So it cannot be done in isolation. It has to be a very holistic approach to make sure that such injection of smaller quantities can be handled by the system. So indeed, room for indeed to get more energy, but the planning must be holistic. Otherwise, it might end up presenting more challenges to the system than intended.
Thank you so much. That is Farai Kanonda, from the African Development Bank, Regional Manager on Energy. Mike, as we give our closing remarks, I would love you to also touch a bit on the energy aspect as well. And also, again, just a reminder of the topic that we're having today and the focal point of the discussion being private-public partnership in Africa, how to create the foundation for the bankability of transboundary projects.
Thank you very much. I think my colleague Farai has eloquently painted the picture and also how we are trying to address that. And I think that's where PPP has been very successful. We've seen a lot of emergence of IPPs on the continent, but as he rightly said, it has to go hand in hand with the reforms in the sector. Utilities has to be reformed, as public entities, has to be supported so that they are adequately to allow the market to function properly. And I think Farai will agree with me that the bank also has a policy forum tool called Africa Energy Marketplace, which he has been working on himself to really address the issue of policy side of things, to go hand in hand with what private sector is doing. Again, to come back to the PPP, which is the topic of today, one fundamental thing that I think I will mention again is the issue of the risk allocation to the party best placed to manage the risk. Very often, we have a high premium on African projects when it comes to PPP because of the issue of risk. First of all, to identify the right risk and then to allocate it to the right person to actually take that risk and manage it. So private sector, as we want to scale up PPP, has to be willing to take more risk on what they are able to take elsewhere in other jurisdictions. But in Africa, it tends to be a bit difficult. For instance, in infrastructure, you have the issue of demand risk, traffic risk, let's say in the transport sector, where it's a huge component of the revenue stream to be generated to finance the PPP. So public sector would like to, sometimes, undermine that particular demand risk and have government to step in. But government also, by allowing PPP to happen, is actually want the private sector to bring in its own expertise, financing, and innovation. So risk sharing is one key fundamental component that we need to be able to get right so that it lowers the cost of PPPs. Because don't forget, at the end of the day, the infrastructure has to be paid by users. We talked about stakeholders before. So the higher the risk premium is, the higher the tariff for the end user will be. And we don't want that to happen. So infrastructure is about service delivery. We don't want it to be, a bottleneck or a pain, or, when you compare the alternative, you start saying this is too expensive, we don't want to do it. But the benefit of PPP is much, much more higher than what we can get from other form of delivering of infrastructure. So that's one. And then the other aspect that I would like to just mention is the offshore project preparation that we just discussed. And I think Towela was mentioning the various platforms that exist, and the PPPFN is actually the creation of ICA, which is Infrastructure Consortium for Africa. That's actually managed by the bank. So we are responsible to make that PPFN work, and we have been doing that, despite the challenges. But it's something that I agree with Towela, we need to revive so that it's become more accessible to project developers, to private sectors, to actually tap into. So you can actually reach out to us at the bank, and we will be happy. Farah is there in Southern Africa, here at the headquarters. So we'll be happy to actually even come to, present the various instruments of the African Development Bank, including project preparation, to private sector in South Africa is something that we can actually envisage. Once again, SABC will have contributed to actually bridge the gap between, the supply and then the demand. So thank you for bringing that up. That's very critical to bring project to investment level. So we need to invest heavily on that. And then the whole idea of public-private dialogue. I think that we have not discussed that today, but the dialogue aspect is very important. You cannot promote PPPs, particularly in cross-border projects, if you don't engage in a public-private dialogue next to public-private partnership. So that's the fundamental thing that will shift the mindset, that will change the culture around the PPPs, because PPP is not the solution, the ultimate solution to project, to investment infrastructure. It's one of the options. And it has a lot of implication for the fiscal contingent liabilities. So you need a strong dialogue between public and private to be able to arrive at a win-win PPPs, so that the one that takes into account the affordability for the country, and also the one that deliver value for money for the end users, which at the end of the day remains, the population, the citizen, and then the business community. So that dialogue for me is very important, and that's what at the African Development Bank we're trying to offer as well in our political dialogue, and the dialogue that we do with the country. Farah is in Southern Africa, they led the dialogue there with African, South African government, and also with SADC to create that enabling environment to deliver PPP. So for me, that's where the challenge is. How do we shift the mindset through public-private dialogue so that we can actually bring both parties together to work closely on PPP, particularly the cross-border one, which is a new area that we are trying to do, to go into. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike. Mike Salo is the Acting Director, Infrastructure and Urban Development at the African Development Bank, and will certainly take you up on that suggestion of having a private-public partnership dialogue, which will be facilitated by us, the SABC and Channel Africa, as well as Mail and Guardian. Dr. Towela Nyirenda-Jere, your closing remarks.
Thank you very much. So I just want to touch a little bit on the energy issue, and then I will just give my closing perspective as well. So I think, and thank you really to Farai for the situational contextualization and also some of the initiatives that he has mentioned. I think important to highlight the fact that AUDA-NEPAD is working with the support of AFDB and other stakeholders on the Continental Transmission Master Plan, which is looking at this issue of the connectivity and the grid interconnectedness across the continent, and which will support the African single electricity market that will allow us to be able to trade in energy, but also export our energy across the continent's borders. We should not underestimate or underemphasize the importance of energy insofar as it relates to industrialization. We keep talking about the fact that for us to trade, we need to have things to trade in, which means we have to industrialize, and that requires energy. At the same time, we're also mindful of the fact that digitalization is key and core to a lot of our services and to intra-African trade, and that also requires energy. We will not be able to have ICT and digitalization if we do not have a robust energy generation system, but also the distribution and transmission as well. So I think we have to always pay attention also to how we're situating the energy sector in our conversations. I think in closing, just in terms of this dialogue, number one, I think to thank SABC and the Mail and Guardian for really putting together this program and on such a very important topic. From our side, I think what we would like to see perhaps is three things that maybe as closing messages. Number one is the need to really focus on how we would unlock the institutional investments. So we know the money is out there, but we need to figure out how we actually get it and how we direct it towards cross-border infrastructure. At the same time, I think we have to look at alignment and coherence between Africa's priorities and the priorities perhaps, or the ways in which funds are channeled from development partners. So we need to make sure that Africa's priorities are paramount in terms of how development partners are approaching and supporting some of the initiatives across the continent. And then lastly, I think people have to be at the heart and at the center of everything that we're doing. So how do we make sure that what we're doing is speaking and responding to the needs of people? So I think we always, we talk about public-private partnerships, and I think more and more we are also talking about public-private people partnerships. So making sure that people are also brought into that conversation. And I agree with Mike about the public-private dialogue, and I'm sure that we will expand that to also then say public-private people dialogue and make sure that people are also brought into that conversation. And then lastly, I think this idea of how we coordinate trilaterally between government, between the private sector, between other actors, I think that's also very important, and it's really at the heart, I think, in terms of our mission as AUDA-NEPAD, in terms of making sure that we can play that brokering and facilitatory role between the various entities and stakeholders. But once again, thank you very much to you and to the listeners and to the viewers for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to call it the Triple P Dialogue, Private-Public People Dialogue. I hope that works for you, Dr. Towela. Dr. Towela Nyirenda-Jere is the head of economic integration at the African Union's Development Agency, NEPAD. Let's hear next from Kutwano Kutwane, who is the CEO at Export Credit Insurance Corporation, South Africa, SOC Limited.
Thank you, Adam. And I want to mention two issues here in closing. At the moment, the public resources, which have been quite critical in bringing most of the infrastructure projects to fruition, are drying up. I mean, our countries are heavily indebted. Very difficult to raise new debt to finance this project. So you are still going to see a lot of mix of foreign aid, which is most times is quite tight, and you are going to see a mix of development financing. You are going to see also in that mix, commercial private funding. But commercial private funding, of course, I mean, is almost if you talk about private banks, it's short term. It's not very long term. It does not mimic the cash flow profile of these projects. Let alone that in most of the infrastructural projects, collection is in local currency, so you have the risk of inconvertibility as well as a currency fluctuation, risk of currency risk as we understand it. So I mean, ECA financing or export credit insurance is extremely important it's an important ingredient, in the mix, because it allows most of the other risks that may not necessarily be, or the private sector may not be able to carry, to be now transferred to the ECA. The manner in which ECA works is that we place this risk on the party that has got the largest capacity to handle that risk, basically being, in case of ECIC, it will be South African government. And therefore, that, in itself de-risks the project, takes the project risk and put it on the back of the party that is able, being the South African government, that may be able to carry that risk better. And we have done, most of the projects that we have done on the continent has been on that basis. And therefore, the advice is that for any arrangement that is being made to fund the projects that are being earmarked, either coming from PIDA or coming from various other sources. That this partnership must actually be encouraged, where from the start, I think Mike, you'll recall that when we were doing the LNG, in which also in that consortium, the ADB was very fundamentally involved, or critical component, given the the ability to de-risk the projects in a manner in which you have explained, not in a particular ECA manner, but in a manner in which the guarantees, the various guarantees that the bank puts in place. And we also have the partnership with Afreximbank. I know that, sometimes people feel that Afreximbank is a bit more expensive, but we have worked with them, and in these large infrastructure projects, basically, I really think that the cost of funding is important, but it's not as critical as, de-risking the project and making sure that the project goes ahead. Because one way or another, in most of these projects, really, the returns over a long horizon attractive. And coming to your point, Towela, this should be actually making a very compelling compelling point for the involvement of institutional investors in these projects. I'll pause there, but before I stop, let me thank you sincerely, and the organizers and the producers of this program. I think it is a fundamentally important manner in which we can reach out both to the continental participants in the infrastructure projects, as well as foreign investors. And thanks for inviting ECIC to this program. Thank you.
And thank you so much for making this inaugural, the Big Africa debate, such a success. You'll be seeing more and more of this happening, and perhaps in between as well. And to the suggestions that have been made, we'll certainly make sure that we try to follow up on those. Dr. Towela Nyirenda-Jere, who is the head of the economic at the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, Mike Silo, who is the Acting Director, Infrastructure and Urban Development at the African Development Bank, and also Kutwano, CEO, Export Credit Insurance Corporation, SC, at the SOC Limited. Thanks once again to all our participants, as well as those people who have been following the conversation this morning. The recording will be available on the SABC's digital website in case you joined us a bit late. The recording will be available if you go onto our YouTube channel, the SABC YouTube channel, you will find it there. I'm going to hand you now over back to my colleague, the old man that is, Nyirenda-Jere. They said I'm young. Can you believe it? That's it.
Thank you, Aldrin, for moderating that very incisive, insightful, and thought-provoking conversation.